This is a day of national consecration. And I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This nation is asking for action, and action now.
The main difference between Hoover and Roosevelt is that Roosevelt has a terrific radio personality, a terrific way of getting himself across to the people. He acts in such a way that people believe that he's on their side, and that transforms their sense of what the Depression is about.
Hoover never had a chance in 1932. His Democratic Party opponent, New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt, swept the presidential election, winning all but 6 states. Roosevelt immediately embarked on the famous 100 Days, a feverish flurry of legislation that formed the core of his first New Deal.
Roosevelt had no great theory about how to get out of the Depression. He often likened himself to a football quarterback who tried one play. If it didn't work, he tried another play. Because the nation was scared to death and there was a cooperative Congress, almost everything that he suggested was passed quickly by Congress.
The first problem the new president faced was a banking crisis. Bank reserves were so depleted that Americans used Canadian dollars in Michigan and Mexican pesos in California. Atlanta and Richmond printed their own currency. So in his first act as president, Roosevelt finished closing the nation's banks, most of which had already shut their doors, and pushed through laws to increase government control of the nation's financial system. When banks reopened after an 8-day holiday, more people deposited money than withdrew it. Roosevelt was already well on his way to reviving Americans' flagging faith in themselves. But Roosevelt realized that the revival would require more than speeches and publicity. Economic recovery would take new federal laws and agencies. So Franklin Roosevelt coupled Hoover's techniques of morale building with an unprecedented buildup of the federal government. The first task was to repair the country's broken industries. In the 3 short years following the stock market crash, the nation's volume of production had been cut in half. Nearly 80% of its automobile factories and 90% of its steel mills stood idle. Roosevelt's answer was the National Industrial Recovery Act. The act allowed the federal government to negotiate agreements that regulated production, prices, and wages in each industry. The goal was to end price cutting and worker layoffs. Roosevelt's other great problem was the failing American farm. Farmers were producing so much that agricultural prices went into a tailspin. Making less money even while they produced more food, farmers couldn't pay back their loans and were forced to abandon their land. Storms and droughts ravaged the Great Plains, transforming 150,000 square miles from the Oklahoma Panhandle to western Kansas into a gigantic dust bowl. Houses were buried, animals suffocated, and children lost their way home from school.
Many days the air is just full of dirt coming for hundreds of miles. It sifts into everything. Dirt had blown into the house all week and lay inches deep. Last weekend, no one was taking an automobile out for fear of ruining the motor. The deaths of many babies and old people are attributed to breathing in so much dirt.
Their farms ruined, hundreds of thousands of people packed up and headed to California and other points west. But life was difficult there too, not just for the newcomer Okies, but for Mexican Americans.
After we lost our farm, we were forced to live on the road, traveling from farm to farm in search of work. the whole family would work for less than $10 a week.
Roosevelt's solution to this farm crisis was another federal law and another federal bureaucracy. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration paid farmers to limit their production, which raised food prices. Millions of Americans could not wait for industry or agriculture to pick up. They were starving. They needed money in their pockets and food on their tables now. For the first time in United States history, Franklin Roosevelt established widespread federal relief. The Federal Emergency Relief Act gave federal money to state and local agencies to distribute to the unemployed. Within 30 days, the Civil Works Administration put 2.5 million people to work, building roads, bridges, and schools. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent 500,000 young men to the countryside to clear hiking trails, plant trees, and drain swamps. Later, other alphabet soup agencies, like the Works Progress Administration, would employ millions more, doing everything from building courthouses to writing books. Roosevelt and his advisors favored these work projects over direct cash relief, even though they were far more expensive.
Give a man a dole, and you save his body and destroy his spirit. Give him a job and pay him an assured wage, and you save both the body and the spirit. Harry Hopkins, Director, Works Projects Administration.
Franklin Roosevelt recognized the power of radio, which let every citizen feel as if the president was talking personally to him or her. At a time of sharp social tensions and divisions, these fireside chats made Americans feel like they were part of a larger, more unified whole.
With the cooperation of various city departments and under the sponsorship of the Crime Prevention Bureau of the Police Department, a number of city streets have been set aside for the use of the children of New York. Safe from the perils of crowded traffic thoroughfares, the youngsters are watchfully supervised by trained instructors removed from relief roles. Every kind of game you can
Images of these New Deal projects appeared in magazines and newsreels, allowing Americans to experience faraway tragedies and triumphs. Moviegoers in New York could feel the Kansas Dust Bowl as it swirled around on the screen before them. They could watch workers in Oregon busily building a huge new dam. And they could visit a Civilian Conservation Corps camp in Vermont, if only for a few flickering frames. When Americans turned on their radios, they heard not only the president, but also his wife. Host of a twice-weekly radio program, Eleanor Roosevelt became known as a tireless advocate of the poor and downtrodden. Within the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt helped African Americans gain access to her husband. Thanks in large part to Eleanor's influence, a so-called Black Cabinet advised the president for the first time in United States history. African Americans continued to face massive hardships on many fronts. The National Recovery Administration's Blue Eagle codes allowed employers to fire blacks and replace them with white workers. Bitter African Americans joked that the NRA was the Negro Removal Act, and the New Deal's poor relief often failed to reach African Americans.
Dear Mr. President, would you please direct the people in charge of the relief work to issue the provisions to our suffering colored people? I'm sorry to worry you with this, Mr. President, but the relief officials here give us black folks nothing but a few cans of pickled meat. And to white folks, they give blankets, bolts of cloth, and things like that. Yours truly. I can't sign my name, Mr. President. They will beat me up and run me away from here, and this is my home.
Franklin Roosevelt never supported African Americans as strongly as Eleanor did. Over the protests of his black cabinet and his own wife, The President of the United States refused to support a federal law to fight lynching. Since Southerners occupied strategic places on most of the Senate and House committees, Roosevelt believed that introducing an anti-lynching bill would cause the Southerners to block every bill he had asked Congress to pass. He would not take the risk.